Hello, everyone. I'm Juliet, but not really. I'm Nick. Welcome back, or welcome if you're attending the seminar for the first time. I'm really pleased that Toby and Trevor have agreed to do a whole series on West Africa for us, and this is the second one, which is going to be on Mali. The next one, which we'll send out some more information about, is going to be on the Asante, and then we're going to look at Benin as well. And we'll send some information around how we're going to share the resources from last week and this week, which will be on the revamped African Kingdom site that Toby has allowed us to modify and adjust and set up as well. Just in terms of housekeeping, please, if you have questions, can you not use the hands up, but can you type them in? We will try and, as we go through the webinar, try and answer them. If not, we'll leave some time towards the end. So without further ado, I'm going to disappear and hand over to Toby.
Okay. Can everybody see my screen? I'm not sure. I'm hoping so. I'm hoping everybody can see my screen. If not, Trev or Nick, please let me know. Okay, good, great. Okay. So, in fact, here we go, show my screen. Well, it's great to be doing this follow-up from the last one a couple of weeks ago with Trevor and Nick, and I'm just really pleased to be doing this. And thank you all for your enthusiasm and participating, those who are doing it for the second time and those who are new. It's great to be here with you. So today, we're looking at the Mali Empire. And as with the last session on Congo, I'm going to give a kind of quite a broad overview of Mali, a bit of background on general perspectives on history of Mali, and then talk about context of the history of the Mali Empire, just to think ways into approaching it for yourselves and for your students, and then talk in some more detail about some really, I think, some of the best things really for teachers about teaching the Mali Empire is, especially in Key Stage 3, although it can be taught at Key Stage 5 in the African Kingdoms option, but this, I imagine, is mainly going to be taught at Key Stage 3. And one of the best things about it is I think it can really bring a totally different understanding to some of your students about what history is, because one of the things we'll talk about, both Trevor and I are going to talk about, is how some of the best ways into thinking about Mali's histories are through sources which many historians don't traditionally make use of, music in particular, and also architecture and material culture. Mali is really best taught through music, material culture. There are texts that can be used as well, and if you put that all together, I think it can really change the way in which students think about what history is and what is a source and how we make use of that. And really, I remember I went into do a session at a school in Plasto with Alan and Karina. I don't know if Alan and Karina are listening in, but hello if you are. And we did a session. I did a session on pre-colonial Africa, and one of the things we talked about was a book which an American historian called Laurent Dubois published a few years ago on the banjo. And afterwards, remember Alan said to me, well, one of the students said that they had no idea that you could write history, that the history of a banjo could be history. And so really, I think this is something which really can inspire students about history in general. And that, of course, is very important as well for, I know, many of you also thinking about, making sure that we retain history students into GCSE and into A Level. So I think that's another reason why this would be a particularly interesting topic. So just going to start by setting some things. And this is actually an image that we looked at last time, I think, those of you who were there last time. It's a famous representation of the Emperor of Mali in the 1320s and 1330s, Mansa Musa, and it's from an atlas which was made by a cartographer, a Jewish cartographer from Mallorca called Abraham Cresques in the late 14th century, around 1375. And as you can see from the image, and it's a famous image, but Mansa Musa is seated on a throne. He's represented, firstly, as we talked about last time, actually, so represented not in the kind of stereotyped and prejudiced ways which representations of Africans by Europeans in the era of the transatlantic slave trade tended to go down that route, as a ruler, holding a gold nugget. So the gold is symbolic, of course, of wealth and the enormous wealth of the Mali Empire at the time. And the fact that, and this is very important, the gold of North Africa and in fact Spain was produced in Mali at this time. And it's also reflective of this map of the presence of Islam in West Africa. You can see many representations of mosques there, and also representative therefore also of the kind of, and we'll talk about this a bit more, and Trevor has written about aspects of this, about the plural cultures that existed in West Africa at this time. You have a strong presence of Islam, but of course a strong presence of African religions, and all of this is in ways represented in this map. So you have early globalization, trade, and plural cultures all beginning to emerge in this very early representation. And I should say, before I go any further, please do type chats into the chat box if you have any questions or queries, and I'll do my best to answer them as we go through. So just also to give a kind of geographical sense of the region we're talking about, this is a representation of the areas which the Mali Empire was in control of or influenced. You see Mali towards the center left of the map. That was the heartland of the Mali Empire in the west of what's now the Republic of Mali, but influencing to the coast along what's now the Gambia, and inland a long way along the Niger River towards Kano and what's now northern Nigeria, and of course very heavily connected to the Trans-Saharan trade, some of the important oases, trading centers like Takasa, Tadmeka. The Battle of Tondibi, which is located there just to the north of Gao, which was again one of the most important centers of Mali, was the Battle of 1591, which led to the collapse of the Songhay Empire, which was the successor state to Mali and was located further to the east from Mali. So that's a bit of a geographical background for you. And then just to give a sense of some of the things that Trevor will be talking about in much more detail later, but also just some ways into thinking about the longevity and importance of this medieval history. So this is the Niger River Mosque in Timbuktu. It's a site which some of you may have seen. It's an enormous building. The construction began shortly after Mansa Musa's return from his pilgrimage to Mecca in the 1320s. It was actually, well, there's scholarly debate on this, but certainly for a long time, scholars argued that the main architect of the Niger River Mosque was an Andalusian called Es-Sahili, who came from Granada in Al-Andalus, which shows, again, this kind of early globalization. So, and we'll talk about this, I'll talk about this towards the end of my presentation, but so this is already a building which speaks to a lot of the themes of the history of Mali. Another very important center of Mali was Djenné, an important city to the west of Timbuktu, further upstream on the Niger River. Again, has a very significant, important mosque, and Mopti on the Niger River. And this is the kind of architecture which was very typical in many of the urban centers of the Mali Empire, and very old, as you can see, buildings made of clay, mud, but also several stories often, and speaking to a very important history of trade and craft, and industry, which was at the center really of Mali for many centuries. Djenné was one of the most important trading cities, in fact, in the Mali Empire. It's worth saying that. So I hope that gives a picture really of the kind of, if you like, the political economy of Mali in the medieval period, or what we call the medieval period in the West. The Niger River was really fundamental to the Mali Empire and to its successor state at Songhay. It was the commercial artery, of course, transport artery, and connected, if we go back to the map, we'll see the regions which Mali fundamentally influenced and was connected to. And then also in this photograph, we see the importance of Islam and the relationship this had to plural cultures and societies which were emerging in West Africa at this time. It's important to say that Islam, the Islam in West Africa was specifically connected to Sufi orders and what is known in the scholarship as Suwarian Islam, which was more accommodating to plural versions of society than other versions of Islam. And this is, I think, significant because it does speak to the type of society, plural society, which emerged in many parts of West Africa throughout this period. Okay, so if anybody has any questions, as I say, please just type into the chat. And otherwise, I shall continue. So here's a kind of timelines really of the Mali Empire, which I thought probably quite useful. It emerges in the 13th century under Soundiata Keita. Now, Soundiata Keita is the subject of the most famous epics in the literature of the Mali Empire and in Manding, the language of the Mali Empire in Manding. And we'll talk about that a bit later, because that literature is kept by the griots, the praise singers and musicians who are also the historians of the Mali Empire. Rises in the 1230s with the defeat of Sumanguru Kante of the Soso people, who's also very much connected in that oral literature to African religious practice. And there are also written, so Ibn Battuta, a famous traveler from Morocco who came through Mali in the 14th century, he mentions at one point the rise of Mali under Soundiata Keita. So there are written sources as well as oral sources which refer to Soundiata Keita. Now, an important milestone, perhaps, certainly in the modern discussion of the Mali Empire, I think, is Abu Bakr II. Now, there is a source from an Egyptian historian called Al-Umari, writing in the 1330s, who describes how Abu Bakr II sent a fleet of ships into the Atlantic Ocean. And some have argued that this suggests that perhaps West Africans had reached the Americas before Columbus. There's a huge debate and discussion about that, which I won't go into here, but it would be certainly interesting for your students to know about that. Then in the 1320s, the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa to Mecca, with a huge retinue through the Sahara, bearing enormous amounts of gold, which was so vast that it caused inflation, which was remembered for many decades in Cairo, and also is symbolized, I think, in the representations of the Catalan Atlas, became famous throughout the Mediterranean world. And that begins, in fact, a very important tradition of pilgrimages. So there were annual pilgrimages from the Mali Empire, from Tahrur, as it was known in North Africa and in the Islamic world, to Mali, and there were hostels for pilgrims from Tahrur in Cairo and in Medina, and this kind of early globalization within the Mediterranean, the North African, the Islamic world is very significant to Mali as it grows through the 14th and 15th centuries. As I've mentioned, Niger River was built from the 1330s. Timbuktu, which is an important center of Islamic scholarship, and really the center of Islamic scholarship in Mali, in the Empire of Mali, accepts the rule from Mali, whose capital and center is located further to the west. But, of course, things change. In the 15th century, Mali's power begins to decline, and as I mentioned before, it moves towards Songhay, further to the east, and this is a process which occurs throughout the 15th century. And in the 1490s, finally, Askia Mohammed takes power of Songhay, inaugurates the Askia title of that empire. And in fact, it also goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca. So this is a process of globalization, the rise of rulership further towards the center of the Sahel, if you like, further away from the fringes of the Atlantic, which some of the arguments suggest, well, for Mali, for example, had suzerainty over the Atlantic coast in Senegal, which falls with the passage of power to Songhay. So all these processes are happening in this in the 15th century. Okay. So moving on now to some context. So that's really sort of background, really. So I hope so that you all got a picture of really an overview of Mali's history and some of the key elements to its political economy, really. So let's move on now to now I'm going to I've picked out 5 contexts, and there are many more you could pick out, but I think that hopefully these will give you all a good starting point. The first is that Mali, of course, doesn't appear from the deep, if you like, from nowhere. It emerges from a previous history of large political units in this part of West Africa with control of Trans-Saharan trading routes. Now, previously, the most important one had been Ghana, which is also known as Ouagadougou, and that flourished from around about the 8th century to the 12th century. And the capital of Ghana was located in what's now Mauritania. These are some of the ruins of Koumbi Saleh, which was, I think, excavated in the 1950s. And these polities, all of them, Mali, Ghana, and Songhay, are all connected. There were migrations from one to the other. So, for example, going to the end of this period, the fall of Songhay in 1591, many of the scholars of Timbuktu, actually, recent academic scholarship suggests that so many of them migrated, in fact, to Mauritania, and many of the libraries from Timbuktu, in fact, went to Mauritania. Similarly, many of the scholars in Timbuktu had come from Ghana, and in Ghana they had been connected to schools of Islamic thought in Morocco, and so on. So this region, really, of North Africa, the Mediterranean coast, and then sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel, was very interconnected throughout all this period. And so Mali certainly doesn't arrive from nowhere. It's also, and because of these connections, a society which has extensive production of sources written by West Africans in the medieval period. And this again connects this long history of Islam in West Africa and to Ghana's history. Now, Ghana had been a plural society with Islamic traders linking Ghana and its peoples to North Africa, but then rulers who observed African religions as well as observing Islam. There were separate quarters for each. In 1076, you have the end of that system. The Almoravid movement of religious reform sees this balance overthrown. Ghana's rulers become Muslims, and this leads to Arabic becoming the language of science, of law, and of philosophy in Mali throughout the medieval period. And so this, I'll pause there actually, because this is a very important point when it comes to teaching, because one of the great things about this history for teachers is that this connects to, that there are very good examples of that. So there are a couple of links on the PowerPoint, which we'll share with you later. Well, I think Nick, we have already shared. But so this was an exhibit at the Library of Congress in Washington. And you see, you can go through various different texts. So this one was copied in 1733, for example, but dates too much earlier, which is a work of astronomy. We can go down to poetry, legal texts, commercial texts, histories, and so on. So as you can see, now these are all texts which have often been copied. So the texts themselves may have been copied in the 18th century, but they are earlier texts that have often been copied. So that's one website would be quite interesting for you to consult. And another one actually is this one, which is TimbuktuManuscripts.org. So the Timbuktu manuscripts, many of you will have heard of this, and the main center really for the work which has been done on the manuscripts of Timbuktu is this one, the Ahmed Baba Institute of Higher Learning and Islamic Research in Timbuktu. And so this is a website which has a lot of information about the manuscripts, their maintenance, their research, the current research. Clearly, the political situation in Mali over the last few years has been very difficult, and some of the materials may be somewhat out of date, but it still will be quite an interesting background for many of you to have a look at. So I think this context of written history, which is quite different really to quite a few other parts of West Africa, is an interesting one and an important one. And then this connects to the globalization that was happening. I've talked about this before. We've seen it in various guises, but clearly this is an important context of Mali. Mali is certainly not an empire which is sort of enclosed within West Africa. There are many there are many connections to other parts of the world, not only to Cairo and Medina, but far afield as Basra. Trades from Basra in Iraq come to oasis termini of the Trans-Saharan trade. And clearly, as we can see, the importance of Mali was known in Southern Europe as well, as the Catalan Atlas shows us. So, I mean, actually, if you were going to compare Mali's connections to the wider world to those of, say, well, Britain, why not, in the 1300s, I think you certainly could well argue that actually Mali was more globally connected than Britain. So that'd be an interesting comparison, I think, for many of your students. Moving on. So, and this is the fourth context. I think this is a very important one. Is really the pluralism of societies that were emerging in many parts of West Africa at this time, and in particular in this case in Mali. And it's been termed Afropolitanism. We could call it cosmopolitanism. But what you see is you have a mixture of indigenous African legal and cultural forms with those which come from Islam, the importance of Arabic as a written language of record, which can obviously keep commercial accounts and form legal cases. But then, of course, the importance of the orality of many West African cultures and how those intersect. And I think a very important point is that actually what happens in Mali really does set a pattern for many future kingdoms in West Africa between the 15th and the 18th centuries, where rulers would often profess to plural religious faiths, accommodating that within a worldview which is really intrinsic to many West African religiosity, which often will observe and practice at different shrines. And so this is an important part of this, which emerges particularly in West Africa. Some people have argued it emerges partly because, for example, of the geographical boundaries of the Sahara Desert, the length of the trading routes, the fact that shared religious identities on either side, either end of those trading routes led to greater trust. So that's why perhaps Islam became, that's one of the theories as to why Islam was practiced both in the Mediterranean end and at the West African end of those routes, creating bonds of trust and trade. But then at the same time, obviously, African religious practice being fundamental, West African indigenous religious practice being fundamental. So that pluralism really was fundamental to many parts of West Africa for a long time, and it only really begins to change in the 18th century, partly with indigenous Islamic scholars and their critiques of these hybrid practices, and partly also, of course, with the arrival of Christian missionaries on the Atlantic coast, providing a kind of pincer movement, if you like, of these ideological forces militating against that kind of pluralism. So finally, and then this actually builds from that that point, that actually the Empire of Mali, a very important element of it is its influence on subsequent polities, its relations to many different kingdoms across a wide range of West Africa. If we just go back to the map, we can see that huge swathe really of West Africa, which is partly the watershed of the Niger River, and partly also the influence of the Wangara traders who traded in the various centres, Djenné, as you can see marked there, Timbuktu, Gao, and then Tucano, and the practices and customs which they brought in that trade. So I think the Kano rises in the 15th century is influenced by those Wangara traders, Mossi also in that period, while Futa Toro in what's now Senegal was founded by Fulani herdsmen, cattle herders who migrated, and scholars actually who had migrated from Mali. So those patterns that we talked about in the last 20 minutes or so had a profound impact in subsequent West African history. Okay, so as I say, yeah, please do type any chat or questions in the chat, and I'll try and answer them. Now,
sorry, just to interrupt. There are a number of questions.
Oh, I can't see them. Where do I?
So once you finish, I will just kind of go through the questions and then you can try and answer them.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nick. Okay.
Right.
Okay, and I'm gonna, because you've been listening to me for quite a while, and I'm gonna put on some Tumani Diabate instead, because I think that sounds like a good idea. So this is Kora music. Some of you may have heard of Tumani Diabate, Kora jelly from Mali, Republic of Mali. Kora music is perhaps one of the things that quite a few of you may think of when you think of this part of West Africa, because in a way it's the thing which has globalized in recent years. One of the aspects of that culture of this part of the world which has globalized perhaps in a better known way than other aspects. And the role of the griot, the praise singer, is very important. And that's, as I mentioned at the start of this, music is a really interesting way into teaching about the history of Mali. And because musicians, griots, are also the historians of Mali, and they sing the praises. Literally, they sing the praises, well, that was their role, to sing the praises of famous warriors, leaders, and rulers. And they actually reinventing that history as historians, you know. And Trevor and I certainly know all about this. We know historians. That's what we do. We reinvent history for each generation. And that's certainly what the history of the griots shows us as well. And in the region which Mali occupied, where Mali flourished, this music was always important. After Mali fell, after Songhay fell, Ségou, which was a very important kingdom in the 18th century in modern Mali, the griots there became very important in legitimizing the rule of Ségou's rulers, because actually Ségou's rulers, in fact, had come from a subject class, slave class, the Tonjon. They had not been aristocracy. So griots always had that role in West African societies, and it's a very interesting way of thinking about music and history. And I'm just going to give you some examples of this. So actually, we're going to sadly close off Tumani Diabate. Just going to play. Now, this is a film which it's a 30-minute film of a conference which took place at SOAS in 2015, and the idea of this conference was to bring musicians and historians from West Africa together to talk about this dialogue between music and history. So any of you thinking of teaching through music, this would be a really good film to look at, I think. And we're just going to play a couple of minutes to give you a sense of what I mean by that. So this is Nakani Kante, who's a singer from the Republic of Guinea. So now the next bit, this is the key bit. It's about a masquerade in Senegambia called the Kankarang.
Toby, I'm not sure they can hear the audio because I can't. So
oh, you can't hear the audio. Okay.
No, it might be a good idea to skip, but we'll put the link in, or the
okay, we'll put the link. Okay, I'm sorry if you can't hear the audio. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Okay, it's there on the website page. Basically, this is an excerpt which shows how the Kankarang, which is a masquerade from in the Casamance, aspects of this masquerade can be found in New Orleans, in the Mardi Gras celebrations, and aspects of that history which is attached to this masquerade and its purpose and meaning are found there, and the music which accompanies that masquerade in New Orleans actually speaks to a lot of the global themes of the history of this part of the world, and also how music and history are intersected. So, you know, that's a film which talks about a lot of that kind of issue, and will help you to think into how to think with music as a historian, which is, as a historian, something I've always found, you know, great fun. And I think, as I said, will really also, I think, be hopefully fun for your students. And another type of resource, I think, which is one of which I know Trevor's going to talk about in a lot more detail than I am, but is architecture. And if we think back to some of those slides I started with, the Niger River Mosque, how it speaks to so many aspects of Mali's past. Islam, globalization, as I mentioned, the architect Sahili came from, or one of the putative architects, people will always argue about that, but came from Al-Andalus. The mosque Niger River also speaks to literacy, to the role of law, to the pluralism of societies in Mali. So, you know, there's so many activities we can think of just building from a mosque, or, as I say in this slide, also following a piece of music. So, for example, the Epic of Sunjata, which, as I mentioned already, is one of the most famous epics. Well, it is the most famous epic, is the foundational epic of Mande literature and music. Following that piece of music can give you a very different perspective on history and what history is, and I think just provides a completely different point of view. So I think that was, you know, that was where I wanted to come to with this presentation, really. So starting with this overview of Mali, and then going through some of the important context which can help students to think about different aspects of that past. And of course, so many of those aspects speak to contemporary experiences, pluralism, for example, globalization. You know, students will be fascinated to find out about the connections of West Africa to different parts of the world in this early period. And you could even connect that, if you wanted to other to similar experiences in East Africa, to the connections to China and so on, if you wanted to draw that kind of comparison in towards the end of the unit. So okay, that's where I'll just finish with, this is some sources for you to get going beyond the links to the music videos and to the Library of Congress and Ahmed Baba Institutes, which can help you get some really important visual aids for your classes. I think for documentary sources, there are some Arabic sources which are very important for the history of Mali, which you can find in those first two. And then Mike Gomez's relatively new book, A New History of Empire in Early Medieval West Africa, which was published just a couple of years ago, is a fundamental new vision of this time and place. And there's a shorter and perhaps more narrative history by which was published in 1973 by Lefsion. And there is a textbook on a chapter in the OCR textbook, I should say, as well, on Songhay, which also does have some material on the history of Mali. So there's some sources to get you going. Nick, shall I try and handle some of the questions now, and then?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go kind of move all over the place because there's so many questions. So I'll pick,
right.
Yeah, pick around about 3 or 4. And the first one,
I'll try and pick 3 or 4.
Yeah. Is Emily's question, and she wanted to ask if there are any accounts of the Black Death affecting the Mali Empire in the 1300s, because the Black Death is very Euro-focused.
Yes.
And you'd like to do a comparison, especially.
That's a very good question. So there aren't accounts of it. There is an archaeologist, a French archaeologist who teaches in the US called Gérard Chouin, that's Chouin, who has recently started publishing a couple of articles on this topic of the Black Death and its impact in West Africa. So it's quite a new research question. There aren't accounts of it, but it would be, you could either contact Gérard Chouin, or I could, while we're talking, I'll try and type into the chat some of his, one of his essays on that question, actually. So you've got a reference to that.
Okay, brilliant. I've just added that, one of the articles that he's written, or it's been reported.
Oh, you've added it. Great.
Yeah, so if there's anything else. Okay. David's question is, what do we know about how Mali was seen in the Islamic world, especially Morocco?
Well, we know quite a bit about that through the sources. So if you go back to the bibliography and you look at the sources in Levsine and Hopkins, so that's a compendium of Arabic sources on West Africa, and there are a lot of those which deal with Mali. It was, and what those sources tell us is that knowledge of Mali grew over, and this part of West Africa grew over time, clearly, and especially once Mansa Musa had migrated to, had done the pilgrimage to Mecca, that grew. So one of the sources tells us, for example, there was a surprise that the gold miners were not Muslim, and one of the interlocutors of Mansa Musa said, why can't you just convert them to Islam? And Mansa Musa replied, well, if we do that, mysteriously the gold stops being produced. There were clearly some religious frameworks around the production of gold which were important, but it also tells us that actually in Cairo people didn't know that much about Mali at that time, although it also would have depended on class, of course, and of course some of the traders would have known much better than maybe members of the Caliph's court in Cairo. But that collection of documents really gives quite a good insight into what people thought of West Africa in North Africa at that time, because they're produced by often armchair geographers, essentially. Al-Bakhri, for example, 11th century source, is an armchair geographer from Al-Andalus writing about Mali, and so you get a good sense of what that perception was.
Sorry, just the supplementary parts of that was, is there anything about the context of trans-Saharan slave trading as well?
You will find sources on that, yes. So I'm just typing in another thing in the chat there, which is an article from Schwan. Yeah, you will definitely find those kinds of reflections. There are historians who've tried to look in more detail at that. Having said that, the slave trade was very important in this period, but it was by no means the only trade, and actually the gold trade was more important. And there are lots of differences between the trans-Saharan slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade. The most fundamental of them being actually that the trans-Saharan slave trade generally tended to concentrate on women and children, and was not one which was connected to economic production, unlike transatlantic slave trade. So the gender dimensions of it were very different, and also the volume, the quantity was much less intensive than the transatlantic trade. But yes, certainly those Arabic sources do touch on that a lot.
Okay, and apologies to the others, we'll try and get to the end, but Otis's question, which is there any evidence that Abu Bakr's fleet reached the Americas?
Depends on who you ask, I think is what I would say to that. I'm not convinced, but some people are. They never returned, so there is quite a lot of archaeological evidence and suggestions that, for example, the Olmec culture of Mexico, there's quite a lot of argument that culture suggests African influences, but the Olmec culture was much earlier than Abu Bakr, in fact. So that wouldn't really speak to that particular example. But if you really want to go into that in any depth, the real book to look at is Ivan van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus.
Okay, brilliant. I think we'll leave the rest because the others are much more focused on teaching. There is a question about the translation on the map that I think you showed earlier on, but we can come back to that in the end.
Just to say also, I think we are thinking of having a final session in a few weeks where we'll try and deal with some of the questions which have emerged, aren't we, Nick? So perhaps we can try and cover some of those. Yeah. So okay, thank you very much.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to Trevor.
Brilliant. Hi, everybody. And I'm just going to try to share my screen here. All right. And let's see, I'm hoping everybody can see my PowerPoint presentation to begin with. So it's very interesting to switch to talking about Mali. And part of the reason for that is because, and it's interesting how this happens, but in the US, in most states, Mali, Songhay, and early Ghana are actually part of the state curriculum, especially at similar ages to what most of you teach, whereas the coastal kingdoms, Asante, Benin, and Congo are generally largely ignored. And the politics by which these things get produced is fascinating in and of itself. But that means that I've had a lot more experience with talking to teachers about Mali than I have talking to teachers about Congo, certainly. And the other thing is that there are a lot of resources out there that are specifically designed curricula for working with Mali. So I haven't designed my own sort of handout curriculum to give to you today like I did for Congo, because I'm going to be able to point to a lot of curricula that have been developed for sort of 4 or 5 or 6 days in the classroom by different organizations out there. So I'm focusing here, and Nick shared with you 2 PowerPoint presentations. One of them is designed around architecture, which we'll get to, because there's not a lot about architecture out there for the classroom for this period. And so I've designed my own PowerPoint for you there. But this PowerPoint, looking at resources for teaching Mali, is going to instead have a lot of links. And I'm going to describe the links and describe why and how they might be useful for you. I did focus on these years, 1235 to 1435. These are the years of Mali's height between the rise of Sundiata Keita, who Toby, of course, described, that first Mansa, that first emperor of Mali, and his story, which we're going to look at quite a bit. And in 1435, really, when Songhay supersedes Mali as the great power in the West African Sahel. So this is a period that's sometimes known as, classical or medieval or imperial Mali, that we'll be focusing on a bit to begin with. And so as always, what I'm really interested in sharing with you is how you can help your students to describe the state and society of Mali, the values that Malians had, how Mali worked as a state, the kinds of contexts that and connections that Toby brought up. And following Toby's lead, I'm also going to focus on some different types of sources you could use with students in the classroom. 3 sources in particular: the written source, music and performance of different types, and also architecture. So I'm hoping from what I give you, you'll be able to construct a classroom experience that really works for you and your students. So let's start with written sources. And of course, as Toby described, I think really well, there are a lot of written sources out there that are available, and some of them are collected in interesting places. So if you go back to Toby's presentation, he pointed to several books that are purely collections of Arabic sources, sources in Arabic from West Africa. I wanted to point to two things that are online, aside from also, I'm also pointing here to Toby's OCR book, African Kingdoms, which, as Toby said, the chapter on Songhay actually has, several very good pages on Mali. So there's quite a bit there, certainly enough to kind of construct a background, a bit of knowledge. So Nehemiah Levtsion's book, which Toby referred to, published in 1973, is still really excellent. It's an excellent piece of research, which isn't to say that there haven't been small additions and debates and such since, but it's free online through sahistory.org.za, which, if you don't know, has been a project of several sort of radical scholars in South Africa to put as much knowledge about Africa as possible online. And I'm proud of myself for saying that like an English person, saying ZA instead of ZA. So I'll just congratulate myself on that for a moment. And then finally, one of the teaching units that's out there that has quite a bit of background and some very nice sort of map exercises is Ancient Civilization of Mali, from williamandmary.edu, William and Mary, or wm.edu. That's actually I believe that's where Gérard Chouin, who was mentioned, teaches. They put together some very good stuff through their education program. This is a teaching unit largely put together by education grad students. It has a number of exercises, as I said, that work pretty well for students, including some great maps that sort of show Mali, show where gold deposits were, where salt deposits were, show these sort of connections to the Islamic world. And so these are some great background resources for you as the teacher. And just a couple more things here. Obviously, I think Toby's presentation that he just gave us is excellent for setting up a lot of the issues, especially these 5 contexts. I mimic Toby here in choosing the Library of Congress's site, Islamic Manuscripts from Mali. There's the connection there. But another site that has some very good lessons, especially around written sources, is the site from the California History Social Science Project, which is headquartered at the University of California, Davis, which has California state money to put together curriculum that matches the standards for the state of California, which include Mali. There's quite a big packet there that's really focused on the idea of Mali as a place of encounter. So again, kind of Mali within the Muslim world of the time, the Islamic world, but also sort of the idea of Mali within a wider medieval world. And so that packet as well is something I would recommend. However, most of these packets don't make available a lot of really usable clips, if you will, or small bits of sources with everything that you would need to teach them in the classroom. And the one that does is this Medieval Sites of Encounter site. It's got 5 sites by very scholarly and reputable Islamic travelers and merchants of this period. Some of them are people who we don't think ever visited Mali. Others are people who we think did. And there are 3 sources on there that I think you could spend a day in the classroom on if you wanted to. One is al-Bakri's source, which I think Toby cited. One is by the great historian Ibn Khaldun, and one, of course, is by the traveler Ibn Battuta, the great traveler and merchant, who really moves all over the Islamic world, all the way from Southeast Asia to East Africa to Andalusia to Mali. And what's great about this particular site that makes it easy for you to sort of drag in and drop is that these sources come with a vocabulary for the students, as you can see there. They also come with something that got cut off when I sort of cut and pasted here, which is a set of questions. And they're quite well-designed questions just to help students say, what can I learn from this site about what Mali was like, what Malian values were like, how Mali was ruled at this time. So to my mind, if you have 50 minutes with students to work on written sources, written primary sources, there are these 3 that in particular are valuable: al-Bakri, Ibn Khaldun, and Ibn Battuta. Nick, you'd like me to go through to the end before answering any questions, is that right? You're on mute, of course.
Oh, yes,
so,
yeah, multitasking. Yeah, please do.
Okay, no, of course, understood. So now we get to music and performance, and like Toby, I'm very excited about using music and performance in the classroom. One of the important things about Griot and Jali, this class of people, if you will, who are experts, expert performers, and also expert historians, is helping the students to understand how they functioned as both innovators, creators, and rememberers, professional historians, so that the stories that come through over time, for example, and I also, obviously we'll focus on Sunjata, on this epic story, so that story, you know, which passes over generations, you can find it in a small community in coastal Guinea today. In some ways, it'll be told quite differently there than it might be told, for example, in Bamako in Mali today. Things change, and they're supposed to change because, like a professional historian, the griot or the Jali is an interpreter of the past, not just a rememberer, but an interpreter of these stories. At the same time, a lot will be the same, and part of the reason for that is because it's musical. And what music does, of course, is that it's a mnemonic device. It's a device that helps condition the story and helps keep the story the same over generations, right? It's easy to change the words to a story you're just telling like this. It's a lot harder to change than in a musical performance, especially when there's such intense training of griots and Jali. And there are a couple of websites here that I think are great background for you to understand some of this. One is this website, growingintomusic.co.uk, which includes this fantastic video, Dakali, the Pledge to the Art of the Griot. And what's fantastic about it is it focuses on, and it's too long probably for you to show students, although you could show very small clips. But it focuses on 4 young people who are trying to become griots themselves in different parts of Mande speaking West Africa. And it shows the training that goes into it. There's also, for a quick read, The Griot of West Africa from the Goethe Institute. It's very good. And at the top here, I've got this website from UC Berkeley's Orias. Orias is for training teachers at UC Berkeley on the hero's journey, Sunjata. And I'm actually going to direct you to that when we talk about working with students as well. I really like that website. It's got some great exercises for students and such, and some resources for you. One thing it does do is it universalizes the Sunjata story as a kind of heroic epic, so that you could compare it, if you would, to you know, Odysseus or Star Wars or any other hero's journey, and that's advantageous. It does kind of take it a little bit out of the context of Mali and Mande, so I'm a little wary of it unless students have been kind of told a little bit or watched a little bit of Dakali, so that they know about what a griot is and what the context is, and you've talked to them a little bit, maybe talk them through Toby's presentation and such, so they're also able to kind of ground it. And if you do that, your next step can be to have them encounter the Sunjata story. So there's a very short 1.5-minute video, which I know now, having watched Toby. Toby had to go first and tried to play video. It didn't work that well, so I won't do that. But this short video shows a bit of a performance of the story and just tells a little bit of the story. And so it's a great kind of intro for students. Now, I think that students can actually encounter the performance itself in one way or another, or maybe multiple ways. And I've given 4 options here. And the first is actually just as a book that's written for really quite young children, called Sundiata, Lion King of Mali. By the way, you'll see it written as Sundiata or Sunjata. Usually you see him as Sunjata Kita, Kita being his father's sort of clan name. Sometimes you'll see it as Sogolon Jata, because his name, Sundiata, is actually a joining together of his mother's name, Sogolon, and his name, Jata, which, by the way, shows how important mothers were in Mali. But normally then he's called Sunjata, and that is the name that's come down to us. So David Wisniewski's book, Sunjata, Lion King of Mali, is quite short. Now, there's also a play that's been put together that you could have students perform. It's quite long. Even if you had them just read it out, it would take probably more than a class period, depending what age they are. But it is quite interesting to have students do the performance themselves, even though, again, it's been moved here to a play that we would recognize in the West as a play. But that's certainly one way they could encounter it. there's D.T. Nyani's book, which is really written for 10th, 11th, 12th graders. I've used it with freshmen in college, so it's quite high level translation. D.T. Nyani sat with griots and did the translation himself of sort of a whole epic. So it's quite a bit. They could read just a small bit. Now, I will say, by the way, some of you may know this, that the Sunjata epic is, of course, the inspiration for Disney's The Lion King. So Sunjata essentially should be king. He has a disability in part. He is usurped by his nephew, sorry, not by his nephew. He's usurped by his half-brother, whose mother schemes to give his half-brother the throne instead. And Sunjata goes into exile and wanders around, and you know, there are hyenas and such, and no hyenas. That's the Disney version. But while students may be fascinated by the fact that this narrative and may recognize the elements of this narrative in the Disney King, the Lion King narrative, I really strongly don't believe that you should use the Lion King too closely to sort of tell the story or spend too much time on it. And if you go online and you're just looking for lesson plans around the Sunjata epic, you will find many teachers who have done that. But I think it's very problematic. The last and you know, one spectacular way to encounter it is to watch the YouTube of the full Sunjata story, Glimpse of a Mande epic, which is quite a bit longer, but it is performed, and it's performed by, you know, experts for them. And so in some ways, that's a, dare one say, somewhat more authentic way for them to encounter the story. But whichever way they sort of encounter the story, I do recommend using this epic as, and in fact, I should say that some of the websites that I've shown you earlier tell the story in just sort of a page or two, if you wanted them to read a page or two. But again, you know, this is a story that reflects a lot of things. First, they'll see a mix of sort of Islam and, you know, local ideas about spirits and animist religious faith. They'll see how cosmopolitan it is in that way. They'll see, you know, these sort of universal themes of heroism, but they'll also see, you know, what is valuable about male archetypes like Sunjata, or female archetypes like his mother, who is loyal, fiercely protective of her son, knows how to wield magic in support of her son, whereas he's sort of heroic, he's sort of straightforward and stand up, he doesn't lie. You know, and we can get the sort of sense of the values that are coming out of it as to how men and women can act. So definitely encountering this performance in some way, one of these ways, I think would be really valuable. So finally, architecture here. And I wanted to introduce you to the Global Architectural History Teaching Collaborative, of which I'm a member, meaning that I consume the materials that they use. They have some huge Mellon grant money from the Mellon Family Foundation and such, and they've gone out to architectural historians all over the place and said, can you make lesson plans for us? We'll pay you a certain amount of money. And so they have this huge store of lesson plans. It's actually enormously valuable, including several on Africa. And what I've done is I have taken theirs. So hang on a second. Let me try to, I don't know how to switch what I'm sharing. Hang on. Oh, here we go. Okay, so, and I've adapted a few of their modules in this presentation that's being shared with you, so that we can look at the architectural evidence then for Mali in this period between about 1235 and 1435. So let me go over a little bit of what this shows. And the notes are there. So, you know, you're welcome to use this. As I said, I am not purporting to have put it together, but I have adapted some of the language down below so that hopefully it will be more useful to your classroom. And I've selected the slides that I thought would be valuable. So what kind of architecture do we see, and what can we know from it in West Africa? Well, the first thing is that these cities that we see in West Africa, starting with cities like Kumbi Saleh, which was the capital of Ghana before the rise of Mali, or Timbuktu or Djenné, emerge, quite early. Some of them emerge in the 6th century. They are linked to trade routes, and so they're trading cities, but they're also compound cities. And this is really important. It's a really interesting thing to talk to students about. That what we mean by that is that they are cities that don't, at the beginning, have a city center. They don't have a palace. They don't have walls around a central area. They don't even in the beginning have a sort of central mosque. They're compound cities, which means that they have lots of different sort of concentrations of people, probably each concentration within the city doing something different, possibly each concentration having a different shrine, possibly each concentration being somewhat of a clan, if you will, related to each other. The technical word for this is hetarchy. In other words, instead of a sort of a central government and a central site, it's people coming together to trade with each other based on their specializations. But it's quite different from a city that we would have, thought to have seen in Europe or Central Europe at the time. Interestingly, there's a lot of argument that early Gaelic cities in Western France, for example, did look like this as well. But it's a remarkable form of city. And then over time, of course, it begins to change. And over time, we begin to see specialization. And with specialization, sorry, not specialization, we see specialization in terms of governance. So obviously, we see the breaking down of those borders, those spaces between the different groups and them sort of filling in. And then we see the rise of things like central mosques and eventually palaces, royal palaces, and also very centralized markets. And they begin to look, by the period that we're talking about, they begin to look very much like we sort of expect a city to look. And you might talk to students about what those changes indicate about the way that societies might be, changing as well, from societies that are maybe more egalitarian and sort of loosely organized to societies that are more closely organized. So taking from a different workshop then, a different curriculum on the same GAHTC website, we can start to talk about what these designs mean and what we can know about them. And certainly one of the first things that we know about them is that the style, the design style, does seem to come from North Africa to some degree when we look at this new monumental architecture. We're looking at these large buildings. Clearly there are design elements being brought from North Africa, including the sort of using concentrated or rammed earth to build. And as Toby said, that may include, since Spain, the peninsula is sort of part of the North African world at this time, including design and styles coming even from as far away as the Iberian Peninsula. So the architecture shows this sort of cosmopolitanism. Now, we can focus on the city of Djenné, the modern city of Djenné, which arises in this time not far from the much older city of Djenné-Djenno. And that much older city of Djenné-Djenno was a city that was really very much a compound city with lots of different groups of people. Djenné may have been formed because Muslims associated the old city of Djenné-Djenno with stuff that was not Muslim, even with sort of older spirits that they didn't want to be too close to, or practices they wanted to be away from. So it arises as a very Islamicized city that really then typifies and exemplifies this style of construction that shows the way in which this society was part of the Islamic world. But that doesn't mean that everything that's sort of local gets replaced. So we'll talk about that. And certainly a lot of the architecture is influenced by local environments, right? So part of what's important about cities like Djenné that are along the Niger River is that they have this really interesting set of building materials, because the mud and silt when the river recedes every year, as it does, is mixed with a lot of fish bone and calcium material. And if you mix that with cow dung, it makes really a fantastic plaster, just a spectacular plaster that's very durable, especially in dry environments. So we have to look at the local environment as also one of the inspirations for the building that goes up. And certainly what we can also talk about is these very sort of much older senses of aesthetics. What's really interesting then is that even within mosques, there are these designs that are both Islamic and non-Islamic in their origin. So the doorway or opening, for example, to a house, it has a couple of elements, some of which are Islamic, some of which are not, and some of which are really purely functional. Obviously, this is great material and the sort of breathable design for a really hot desert area. But the opening that you see here, the doorway, is of an older style, probably pre-Islamic style, in which it's got two pillars that are considered to be feminine, and then an opening between them that is considered to be masculine, which I think is very interesting. And I don't know if you can share that with your students or have them speculate on why that might be. But certainly an older style, and we'll look at some more stuff like that. But then also always surmounted by these 5 beams. And these 5 beams are 5 in number, we're told, because they reflect the 5 pillars of Islam. And also the 5 fingers of the hand of Fatima. So we're told that they are very much Islamic, but then also we've got these sort of buttresses that are surmounted by these ostrich eggs, which are supposed to speak to fertility as a reference that's not Islamic. So we begin to see then the mixing of these systems in this architectural style that's really then reflective of everything that Toby was telling us about the kind of cosmopolitanism or Afropolitanism that's happening in these areas. The Great Mosque of Djenne was, of course, built much larger than before after the return of Mansa Musa. It probably predates as a mosque. It predates Mansa Musa, or so we are told. But Mansa Musa returns, and when he returns, there he is. He rebuilds this mosque. He actually goes on a huge building sort of, he starts building, he's got a campaign of building mosques especially, but also other infrastructure across the kingdom, across the empire upon his return from his pilgrimage to Mecca. So here again is the mosque at Djenne, and this is its modern incarnation. How much has it changed over 600 years? Look, you do have to rebuild and plaster buildings, and you also expand them. But a lot of the design seems to have lasted a long time. And again, one of the most interesting things, this is definitely an Islamic building. It's a mosque, but the design definitely calls out to local animistic sort of religious ideals. The facade here in the northern face definitely reflects masks from sort of local people, including this. This is a Dogon mask. So the Dogon are not Muslim and have resisted Islam really in many cases up to the modern day. But a lot of their sort of masquerade designs match features in architecture. And then finally, it's worth talking a little bit about who builds this stuff, because these builders are a hereditary group, a mason. These hereditary groups are called tong, and they are believed to be very spiritually powerful in different ways. These different tongs. The masons are called the bari tong, and it is important that they're the ones who do the building because they're connected to sort of ancestral knowledge, if you will, that again operates, if you will, outside of the realm of formal religion or Islam, but definitely alongside it. And the really interesting thing is that, for most Malians, there's no problem in reconciling these things and these things going alongside each other. And that again, I think, is very much the point that Toby was making. So that's what I wanted to say about architecture. And so I hope that you can then, how do I stop sharing is the question. I hope you can then integrate this into your materials that you've got, including using the Sunjata epic maybe, including I think really some of those primary sources, those documentary sources, and really starting, as I said, with the ideas that I think Toby gave you. And I will stop there. And I don't know if I need to hand things over to, oops, I'm not really good at that. Should be.
No, you're fine. If you keep there, I'll go through some of the questions as well. There are lots. So this is from Paula and Anna, which basically asking you, Trevor, what is the role of women in Mali? And you mentioned about how important mothers were. And do you have any other information about why and how they were important?
Yeah, I mean, we have certain sources. So one of them is, and this is available in some of the packets that I sent you, Ibn Battuta's comments on women in Mali, which have to be taken with a grain of salt, possibly. But, you know, Ibn Battuta definitely says, oh, I'm in a part of the Islamic world where women are very sort of liberated and they can go out without wearing any facial covers and things like that. Possibly, you know, that's accurate. So, you know, we have some sense of that. I think the most important thing that we can speak of, however, or if you really wanted to talk about gender, is to use that Sunjata epic to do it. Because it talks about the role of women in a variety of ways, because Sunjata's story is very much the story of, in part, his mother, who is virtuous and always presented as virtuous in every, you know, part of the story. And so anything that she does can be seen as a virtue. And also Sunjata's sisters, especially his main sister, who's seen as very virtuous. And so if you read the epic, everything that she does is how a woman is supposed to act. And then this Sasuma Beret, the mother who, the whole thing about Sunjata's half-brother taking the throne from him is it's not actually his fault. It's his mother's fault, who is a very bad woman. And she's a sorceress of the wrong sort. And she is jealous, and she isn't about, you know, sharing these sorts of things. So you've got these archetypes, these female archetypes, one how a woman should act, and one very much how a woman shouldn't act. And these come out in every version of the Sunjata epic I've ever heard. And hey, Toby, if you have anything to add, you know.
Well, I was just, yeah, I mean, the one thing I would say is that following up your first point, you know, we also have sources on Songhay Al-Magili's texts from 1500, which talks again, as you were saying, in terms of Ibn Battuta, about the fact that women were interacted freely with men on the streets and weren't covered. And so there are quite, and actually we have quite a lot of sources even up to the 18th century which talk in those terms about the Sahelian region. So I think there are quite a lot of sources which confirm that. And as you say, beyond that, yes, the Sunjata epic, as you say, reading into that, and then also, of course, the role of Jalis and the role of the woman's voice, which is also very important.
Right, and so that's an important thing about Jali or griot, is that women have always played a role in that tradition, which is very interesting as well. So I think that's the most I can say. Yeah.
Sorry, just as a follow-up to that as well, that Tony's asked a question: were women involved in the construction of houses in Mali?
I don't believe so. I mean, you know, well, housing is hard to know, I guess, in terms of personal houses, but certainly they weren't builders, or not certainly, but as far as I know, they weren't builders. And I do know that the baritone today is male. So I don't think.
Yeah,
so.
As you said, variety. These are guilds. These are guilds, yeah. and they tend to be masculine guilds. Those craftsmen.
Okay, so what were the dynamics of class conflict in the Malian Empire? And this is from Nathaniel.
Yes, well, class, right? I mean, it's difficult. I mean, there are things that you can apply here, and you can talk about things. I mean, we've used terms like caste in the past to talk about specific hereditary groups. But you know, and there are these specific hereditary groups like blacksmiths and hunters, but they're very small. I mean, I'm interested in what Toby has to say. I will say very quickly, I don't actually think that class is the best frame through which to understand what's going on, in part because the power of extended lineage groups is so important. The last scene of Sunjata, usually in the telling, is when Sunjata gives different power, different authority, and different suzerainty over different lands to different families. And so within the Mande world itself, I don't think it was so class-riven. Now, the question for me is always, if Mali becomes an empire and it's ruling a lot of people who are not of the same Mande group, you know, the same sort of ethnicity initially as the people who create Mali, do they form a subordinated class out in other parts of the empire? And I've actually seen several sort of opinions or ways of talking about this. I mean, you know, cities like Timbuktu, Timbuktu is mainly not Mande. It's sort of like, you know, there's almost a little distrust of these urbane cities that the Mande kind of conquer and take over and rule. But I'm not sure if class per se is a frame that works as well for talking about Mali as it does for talking about our own society. Toby, what do you think?
No, I'd agree with that. I think I think actually going back to the points you made, caste and work are very interconnected. So you say you have the blacksmiths, you have the masons, you also have the griots, and that's an important point. The griots are themselves an endogamous caste. Not only that, but they're actually despised by the rest of the population, so much so that they're actually buried outside of the cities, often in baobab trees, in many parts of the Mande influenced world. So actually, I think you can, obviously we can talk about elites, the ruling sectors of society, the TransSaharan traders who have, and the Wangara who have connections and have a broader cosmopolitan awareness, and they may rule a sort of mobile class. You could perhaps talk about mobility, maybe mobility and caste perhaps, and certainly in terms of how people would have viewed themselves and their own historical experience, I think are probably more appropriate. It's a more appropriate sort of terminology than class, because I think, yes, in a way, each of those castes is a class. I mean, this is a very they can do, but in a way, we're getting into definitions there. And class is certainly something which is associated with, you know, a Marxist view and a structuralist view of society, which isn't necessarily real to people's experience, which I think is one of the interesting things for students. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there isn't a bourgeoisie and there isn't a working class, if you will. But this is a very good point you brought up. I mean, you know, people who had power or who were believed to have power in different ways were both exalted and at the same time, you know, you were suspicious of them. And this describes many of the castes in some ways. I mean, you know, if you read Sunjata, it starts with a hunter coming in to the community and kind of foretelling the birth of Sunjata. Hunters lived outside, you know, they were believed to be sort of dangerous. They're associated with the wilderness, you know, in some ways. But they were also, they had powers. Blacksmiths had powers, and they were very, you know, powerful, important, could be wealthy, but you were also quite suspicious of them. And the same is true of griots. This doesn't mimic, you know, sort of a grand class structure, but it certainly tells us that the great mass of sort of agriculturalists, you know, most people were suspicious of these people on the margins a little bit.
I mean, I think that's a very good point you make there, Trevor. I think in a way, instead of class, I'd talk about power and powers, actually. People who had certain powers, and hunters are an important one. Hunters also had spiritual powers, and that was very important. And in fact, most every society whose origin stories I've read in West Africa was founded by hunters. And that's something which might connect to the Sunjata epic and its influence, and it might simply connect to the spirituality and the role that had in the way that people perceive society. So I'd say, you know, power and powers are a way that people viewed themselves rather than just through class. Yeah.
Very good point. Yeah.
No, I think that's a really important point. I suppose it links to the seminar last week, which is, you know, we have to be careful when we think about what constitutes a source, but also some of the categories that we use normally in history teaching, and then just trying to transpose that without actually thinking about what that means. But that's a really, really good question. Max's question, which is, are all medieval primary sources coming from the Islamic Mediterranean? And do we have any 14th century sources written by Malians?
Well, okay, well, so part of the problem is what's a Malian, because some of these people do move there and then they're there for quite a while. But so if we're talking about Mande, so they're all written in Arabic, or you know, something, a version of Arabic, as a written source. But many of them are written by people who live in Timbuktu, right, which is under, you know, Malian rule, and they, you know, some of them are, like, you know, resident there quite a bit. So, you know,
but there is also, I mean, my PhD supervisor, Paulo Farias, the book he wrote in his career was, he used actually headstones, funerary headstones. There are a lot of written sources from cemeteries in West Africa written in the medieval period, written by Africans, which was what he used to base a quite different interpretation of the history of Timbuktu. So there are those sources, but for Paulo, that involved spending 30 years in the deserts of Mali and Mauritania, which is quite an interesting thing to do, but it's not for everybody.
Yeah. So there you go. There are some.
Amazing research projects. The next question from Sarah is, are there any connections between the development of trade in Mali and the Silk Roads?
Well, okay, so let's go to Janet Abu-Lughod, who I will come back to, you know, to. So, you know, the world systems theory of this time that I think does fit pretty well. And Janet Abu-Lughod is actually, you know, she's a scholar who started working on medieval Cairo. And so from there, she had a view, because Cairo, you know, Cairo and Baghdad are these places where all these routes sort of intersect. Certainly, the answer is yes. The answer is that there's some sort of like archipelago, global archipelago of trade between trading cities, stretching from, you know, Hainan and these cities in China to London producing wool at this time, to gold coming in from Mali. The gold that goes from Mali to Cairo, where does it end up? Well, you know, at this time, the gold sink of the world, the place where gold went was you know, India and China. So I would assume a large part of that gold did go there. You know, how good is the research into this? I'm not sure, but certainly these places, these trading routes, they intersect in the middle of the Islamic world, and that's where like everything ends up, you know?
Well, as Trevor said, you know, material objects are the way to think about this. And I would point, perhaps not very surprisingly, to cowries, actually. I mean, where do the cowries come from? The cowries, which Ibn Battuta talks about on the 14th century, are coming from the Maldive Islands. They're coming through along the Silk Roads. And actually,
Right.
Also the archaeologist Sam Nixon, who's now the curator of the Africa Route collections at the British Museum, but he's published various articles about the digs he did in northern Mali in about 10 years ago, which show the variety of objects, many of them connected to the Silk Road, which were there.
Yeah, I mean, the cowrie is fascinating to think about because, and here you can teach your students some basic economics. I mean, the cowrie is actually worthless in the Maldives because it's everywhere. There's huge amounts of them. What is so valuable about the cowrie that it's worth making it into a currency in West Africa? It's valuable because there aren't any, you know, they're really scarce. And why are they really scarce? Because they're coming all the way from the Maldives. So, you know,
and also because you know, the rulers can control their import, and that's something which is important. Right. If you're in charge, you need to control the money supply.
Yeah. So yeah, excitingly connected, I think.
Okay, brilliant. And this is from Paula, and she said that she's read that Abu Bakr was Mansa Musa's uncle. And that he chose Mansa Musa not related to rule after he went away on a ship. Is this correct?
I think that is what Al-Umari tells us, so we'll have to go with that.
Yeah, right, as far as we know.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So this is from Moana, asking, is there any evidence of the Israelites' influence in Mali? Which I'm not.
There certainly was I mean, is that meaning that I'm not sure if that's the Jewish? I mean, there was a Jewish. Yes, Jews lived in Mali. There were Jewish communities in the Sahara, and their graves, their cemeteries were excavated in the late 19th century. And there were Jewish communities in Mali into the late 15th, early 16th centuries. Then they declined.
The only thing I would add to that is that. Answering that question, I mean, I think that's fundamentally the factual answer. Answering that question a slightly different way, which is to say that many groups in West Africa claim descent from either Egypt or from the original Jewish tribes, if you will, the original Israelite tribes and such. And so, you know, is that claim metaphorical or is that claim literal? I think that in the main, it's metaphorical. The Mande themselves are descended from people who had been living where they're living for a lot longer than sort of the biblical age. So just to make sure that, you know, that kind of they were an autochthonous sort of indigenous, if you will, people by and large, who had been living there for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Trevor, it's an important point. There was a huge literature in the colonial period by colonial officials about supposed Hebrewisms among the African peoples of West Africa, and as you say, is it a metaphor? A lot of hugely long books were written about this.
Right.
It's very interesting. It's, as you say, I would go for the metaphorical view, but others don't.
Yeah. Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Moana, because I wasn't sure I understood it either. And just one more question, and then just to kind of round some things up. And this is Nathaniel's question, and it's asking, what are the interesting or controversial questions to ask about the history of Mali in this period?
Toby already mentioned one, which is of course the, you know, Atlanticization story, and Ivan van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus, which is sort of highly debated. But, you know, Cheikh Anta Diop, one of the foremost sort of scholars, African scholars, Francophone African scholars of the early independence period, argues that there are these deep linguistic and cultural connections between Mali and Egypt. You know, pharaonic Egypt, and this sort of Afrocentric theory doesn't seem to be as popular in the UK as it is in the US, where it's deeply engaged. And I mean, I guess there's a controversy there about whether you know, Mali has these much older connections to the Mediterranean world than this sort of, you know, period that we're looking at. I think the evidence there is also a little thin, but it's certainly a controversy.
Yeah, and perhaps less controversial, but I think quite fundamental. Something I mentioned in my book is, you know, quite a few people have done studies who suggesting that Mansa Musa, in comparative terms, is the richest person who's ever lived. So, what happened? You know, how come the Mali Empire and then Songhay declined quite rapidly in the 16th century?
Yeah, by the way, there is one. I mean, you know, the people who attempt to quantify just how much gold he brought with him to Cairo, you know, it's very hard to quantify. But what we can quantify is that his visit to Cairo coincides with a sort of pretty massive deflation of gold, not only in Cairo but in parts of Europe and such as well. You know, it's a lot of gold.
Brilliant. Toby seems to have disappeared. Okay, I'm going to quickly wrap this up because there is one. Sorry, Toby, do you want to contribute?
Nick, actually, Nick, yeah, because we had a question for you, Nick, because we had a question last week with.
Yeah.
What? Well, you know the question, Nick.
Yeah. Sorry, because I think Toby's sound, which is what the question was. You know, what can we do to, you know, if your HOD or your school is resistant to teaching the topic. So I'm going to give an answer from a history teacher point of view and also from a leadership team point of view, which is from the history teacher point of view, you know, we should be providing a broad and balanced curriculum, not necessarily to use Ofsted's words on this, as possible. So, you know, to kind of reject this or even think, well, actually, what are we doing as a department, you know, in terms of teaching particular subject areas? You know, these are things that we should be looking at, especially if we're trying to say, you know, we're offering the students before they reach the GCSE cutoff point a really broad understanding of the society that they live in and the world around them. So, you know, that's the kind of very nice view. I suppose, you know, from a leadership team point of view, you know, what would make leadership teams jump is someone saying, well, are you really teaching British values here about respect and toleration? Is the curriculum really broad enough in terms of Ofsted definition? And I can pretty much imagine, if you pose those two questions, or parents proposing those two questions, the leadership team will, and middle leaders will sit up and take a bit more notice around that. So I think there's a good historical, pedagogical, subject knowledge argument to have within the department around how and why you should be teaching these subjects. But beyond that, let's use the regulatory frameworks in a very positive way if we need to, in terms of getting that message across. So I hope that's addressed that particular question. I think we seem to have lost Toby in California as a result, but just really want to wrap up and say thank you to.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, you're back, Trevor. Okay, brilliant.
I wasn't gone. I just took away my image, so you didn't have to look at me while Nick was talking.
But yeah, I think I don't know if Trevor or Toby, do you have anything else to say in terms of pushing?
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, no, brilliant.
Thanks for listening. I hope it was useful.
Yeah, no, I mean, once again, absolutely fascinating in terms of the kind of content and also the teaching resources. There's a lot of stuff that I think we need to, as history teachers, kind of take away. But I think the important part that's really stuck in my mind, which I suppose is a carry on from last week, is really to understand the societies within their own particular context, rather than just trying to glom some of the stuff. A terrible word, but I think it kind of adequately describes some of the problems that we have. Some of the categories that we use for teaching European history, or that we really use, and actually not getting into the sources. And I think this is one of the issues around teaching this, that we don't have enough subject knowledge. And I don't know how many students have studied African history. I only did a little bit, and that was really kind of post 45 African history, and I'm not sure many other students have had that opportunity. But I think we need to make sure that we ground whatever we're doing within an appreciation of the culture, rather than just saying, well, here's some interesting stuff, let's just fit it in. This, as I mentioned before, is the second in the series. I think the date for the next seminar will be on the 12th of May, and that will be on the Asante Empire. So we'll send some more information out around about that later on today. This is being recorded. All the resources will be made available to you. And then, as I mentioned before at the start, we'll be putting the resources from last week and these resources on the revamped African Kingdoms website. So you should go away and have have all the information that you need, especially the sources. There are so many tweets coming in, people sharing some of the websites and various other things that have been mentioned by Toby and Trevor. So there's lots of great stories that you can pick out, and lots of great sources too. So thank you once again to Trevor and Toby for giving up their time and sharing their expertise. And we'll see everyone in a few weeks' time. Okay, thank you.